Mary's rededication, so we're not getting divorced.
Probably more.
Really.
I can give you Altoids.
When you're like me and you came up through the
You like a wintergreen Altoid?
That took me 2 years to learn.
Yeah, we've been.
I don't want it up till about
Jerry Wise.
That was a good move going down. Or they put you down with me first, if I remember right. And for doing what? I don't know. George seemed to think.
Yeah, whatever it was George wanted me to do.
Can I get
I did
Jerry
learn
Weiss really knew how to budget.
I did learn a lot though working for George.
I'm sure.
There's this ASOS around there that
Probably one of the things he learned was how to shorten his memo.
my next one said.
I learned a
I
lot.
remember him writing 90 pages, and I'd take that
Yeah,
and pull
especially
it
if
down to about 50.
getting that to where we needed to do what they wanted to do is
I'll tell you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I call to order the work session for the Sierra Vista City Council for June 11, 2018. We have all the council members here, and today will be a discussion on the first portion will be the discussion of the budget for the fiscal year 2018 and 19. And first slide has Mr. Patuchik's name on it, but I'm assuming we're going to have the Assistant City Manager, Ms. Yarborough.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Mueller, members of the council. Yes, Ms. Yarborough will be doing the presentation. Of course, we're here and staff to answer any specific questions council may have with regards to the budget. This is the first of 3 scheduled meetings. I don't think it'll take 3, but 3 are scheduled in case we need to go to 3. So today is the overview, and then we'll start drilling down into some more specifics after we go through the overview. All the presentation is before you, so there is really no planned cutoff time. If you care to keep going through the slides and asking questions, we'll keep going as long as you care to do that today.
And we're scheduled, I would just mention, we're scheduled for only an hour and a half today.
Yes.
If we need to extend, I'll ask for that. But I will tell you, I have to be somewhere at 6, and I probably need to go clean up a little bit, so I don't look like I just came from a city council meeting before I show up.
We'll give you plenty.
I'm supposed to be somewhere at 6 too, but we're here at.
Yeah, but it's different places, and I know I have to be where I have to be, but you don't necessarily have to be where you have to be.
No, that's true.
Okay.
But we're at your disposal nonetheless. I just want to thank Victoria, who led the budget team, and David, Linda, all the department heads that put together this proposal for you. Of course, the many meetings that we've had with the council already, and I'm just pleased to report that the budget is balanced with no tax increases contemplated except for the rate increase on refuse that the council recently enacted. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Victoria. Please feel free to break in with questions at any time, and of course, I'm here to help and clarify anything that needs to be done. So with that, Victoria.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of council, and Chuck. So our agenda today, as Chuck mentioned, we're going to go over the 2 changes that there were to date from the tentative budget book. We'll go over a budget summary and hit revenue. Oh, somebody might have put times on this. Budget summary, revenue, debt, hit the highlights of operations and maintenance, cover our personnel, and we'll finish up with a review of our capital projects. Again, there's as much time as we need through tomorrow and Wednesday, so please don't hesitate to ask any questions. So the 2 changes to date since the tentative budget book came out, since the approval of the refuse rate increase, in the refuse fund, the charges for service were increased $325,000, and the carryover was consequently decreased by the same amount. Our state shared revenues came back last week, and we were pleased that they were $42,000 over what we had projected. And so we shifted that increase to community development in their planning and professional services line to carry over 3 projects for the West End redevelopment program this year. And so that will be in addition to the $50,000 that is already budgeted for next year for the West End redevelopment program.
So you're saying we'll have $92,000 next year available?
Yes, Mr. Mayor.
Okay.
A snapshot of the budget with all major funds. The general fund, as we discussed over the past month, is increasing approximately $1 million. That is due to local revenues up, state shared revenues are up slightly, and so the budget will reflect that accordingly. In the HERF fund as well, the HERF fund is projected to be up for this year. It was also up last year over actuals, so that amount will carry over and is reflected in the additional projects scheduled for streets in the upcoming year. The change in the LTAF fund, which we have not received LTAF funds for a number of years, but the fund is still called the LTAF fund. That is our transit line, and you'll see the decrease because the track system, which is our automated fueling system, was budgeted out of that line. And so that is a capital reduction since that project is finished.
Excuse me, Victoria.
Yes.
Where's LTAF funded? What dollars fund LTAF?
That is,
Those are your transit grant funds?
Grant.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
Transit
any
grants.
revenues associated with the transit system.
Okay.
It's kind of mislabeled when you say LTAF, you're talking about local transportation funds, and which is basically the funds we originally got from the lottery, which we no longer get because they changed the structure. But again, it's local transportation funds is probably what that should be listed.
Yeah, and at some point, we need to be talking to the league about having those lottery funds restored. They were voted on by the voters. That was the money that was used to fund the subsidy for the transit system. And when that went away, of course, that caused us to need to use general funds in order to subsidize. And of course, that creates other problems then.
But that's going to be more of a challenge because they actually had the legislature change the way the funds were spent. There's a series of buckets, and the first series of buckets gets filled with a certain amount of money. Once the people have played and paid into that much money for the lottery, then it goes down to the next series of buckets, and that's where the LTAF fund is. And the lottery hasn't made enough money in the last several years to go to that second tier of 3 or 4 buckets. But that's all in legislation, so we'd have to go back and get the legislature to redo that portion.
Especially since when the lottery was introduced, it was that those months.
It was sold to the public on education and transportation. Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, we're just pleased we're getting a little bit back from HERF, so we got a ways to go, but we need to keep working on that because they should restore that funding.
the airport fund is some good news. It is up significantly from years past and is fully funding the airport for the first time in some time. That comes with some unfortunate circumstances. It's up primarily because of the fire seasons over the past few years and the fuel sales. But what that has meant is some additional projects budgeted in that line. We will be removing the dirt mountain out there as an economic development measure to make it more attractive to somebody who might want to come in and build a facility out there. And then also budgeted in there is an environmental assessment for taxiway expansion.
Another comment, Victoria. Any building that goes on out in that area would have to be something that pertains to the airport. Is that correct? Essentially, or could it be anybody who wanted to build a...
It would probably make the most sense. I don't believe it's necessarily has to be airport related.
I think by the
I don't
deed,
know.
Victoria, it does need to be
Okay.
airport related.
But it's a wide definition.
The airport sign that the Airport Commission has been talking about for the last couple of years. I know that we've got a little bit of extra revenue that's come in. Is there, I know it's not in the budget, is there some room to work that in with taking a little bit from some of these other pieces? such as the study or the removal of the big giant mountain out there? Is there enough to scrape together something if we're going to put the investment in to start doing the marketing piece as well?
Mayor Mueller, Councilmember Mount, we have budgeted what we think is the full amount necessary to remove enough dirt from the land that we own to make it a viable project. We are working on alternative ways to defray the cost of that, to include bringing in private developers and other people that may need fill to haul dirt away from there and hopefully reduce the cost. So I think later on in the fiscal year, if we're successful in those efforts, that would free up funds to take a look at other projects in the airport fund.
Would the airport sign constitute monies that could, or excuse me, would the monies here constitute being able to use for that airport sign?
Yes.
And the other thing that we talked about too was the weather station
We
as
were
well.
just talking about that. Right now, it looks like they may have actually found an old AWAS out there somewhere.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So,
Learn something new every day.
so I was just told in passing, but we have a commission meeting next week, and we'll hope to have more information then.
And hopefully we'll be able to get that up and operational as well.
Yeah. Mr. Mayor, members of council, Carol Thompson, the airfield manager at Libby Army Airfield, did confirm that they have an ASOS system out there. It's very similar to an AWAS. That system still may be able to report back and give the pilots the information they're asking for. So I need to follow up with Carol. Unfortunately, she's been ill lately, so I'm waiting for the right opportunity to do that.
And the backup plan that the commission brought to us, not to steal your thunder, but what was also just reported was that was something that they brought up during their annual meeting, and it's so inexpensive that contingency funds could probably cover that later on down the road. So I think solving that problem is
Pretty much
probably
done.
there.
Yeah.
So I think the only other thing is if we can find a way to scrape out the money for the sign out there I think it's a good idea. And if there's money that's in the, we can scrape together, I'd like to see that happen.
The increase in the capital improvement fund is due to the additional projects that have been budgeted for this year. The substantial decrease in the sewer fund is due to the bond refinance that occurred last year, as is the decrease in the all other fund line. And then the slight increase in the refuse fund is due to net cost increases. It's a snapshot of the overall budget by expenditure type. You can see that personnel is 47% of the budget, O&M is 32%, capital is 9%, and debt is 6%. For a total of $69,969,346.
Here's my concern with this, and I know that we're taking a step in the right direction, but when are we going to start looking to replace some of these older facilities and things that we have? I know we've talked about it, and I know it's all about cash flow and having the money available to do the projects, but my biggest fear is that I don't see our personnel costs outright decreasing due to things like PSPRS and some of the others that are affecting it. What I'm more concerned with is our O&M costs could continue to take a hit on that a little bit, and it becomes more expensive over time to repair and fix aging infrastructure than it is to outright replace sooner or later. So what's the big plan to start looking at replacing some of these aging pieces of infrastructure so R&M costs can get right?
Well, Mayor Mueller, Councilmember Mount, those are good questions, and I know Victoria has a slide towards the end that talks about the various issues that still remain with the budget process. We have two large cost areas: street maintenance. We're woefully underspending what really needs to be spent to maintain the streets to proper condition, and then the other are aging facilities like OYCC and others that we have out there. Right now, the plan is to bring to you some options in the strategic planning process starting at the beginning of next calendar year. We're already starting to take a look at how we can use the funds that will be freed up in the 2021-2022 timeframe when the two large bond issues are paid off. That should free up upwards anywhere between $500,000 and $1 million a year. That can go a long way towards making a dent in some of those projects, particularly if we use bonds to do that. So, but there's a number of different options we want to present for council's consideration at that time. I believe the time is here now to start discussing how we deal with those issues.
Okay, thank you.
Our revenue summary by fund, as mentioned before, our city sales tax, we were 4% over last year's actuals this year, and so we have added that in with an additional 2% increase we feel is conservative projection for next year. Under licenses and permits, we are anticipating building permits being up next year. The increase in grants funds is budgeting for the MPO and Fry Boulevard and North Garden Avenue project. Local government payments, that decrease reflects the 1.9 million decrease after the actual Fort IGSA contract was budgeted. Ambulance fees are less. We felt we overestimated last year, and so that is budgeted on what actuals came in at this year. There are small increases in fuel. Planning revenue, our plan review numbers are up as well, and we anticipate that continuing next year. The increase in investment income is because interest rates are up. The sale of fixed asset, the additional $500,000 there is budgeting in anticipation of hopefully selling Kings Court soon. What staff's intent is with Kings Court is to advertise the notice of intent to sell beginning this Sunday. After we do that for a period of time, we'll be able to put out an invitation for bid. And if any bids are received that meet the reserve, then the city could choose to go with it. We've also retained Frank Morrow with First West as a broker for the property. If no bids come in during the invitation for bid, then it can be listed as any other commercial real estate, and we would seek to sell it as soon as possible. Yes, ma'am.
What does the property cost us yearly in upkeep?
Laura, do you have a number on that?
I don't. You can get it.
We can get that.
I've got a few questions. I'm not sure if I want to. When are we going to start? Are we going to dig deep into each one of these, or should I'll just ask questions. How about that? The first one is on the ambulance revenue. This also takes into account the contract that we have with the Fort, correct? That's a firm fixed price contract. We are not losing money on that, just the revenue is below. Is that an accurate statement?
Yes.
Okay. And then is there a projection for the revenues to come back up to what we thought they would be?
The main difference in the revenue is not related to the Fort. The main difference is we're adding transport crews. And the first transport crew, we did see an increase, and the second transport crew, we did not see a similar kind increase in the revenues.
So a transport crew within the internal city fire
within
department
the regular
structure.
internal city fire department. So, and that estimate does include the ambulance, the Fort contract revenue, and that is based off the runs that we get for up there. It does fluctuate a bit, and we've got 4 months of actuals so far as it. So that is on track to meet the projection. The Fort contract ambulance revenue is on track to meet the projection.
Okay, but
that was not a firm fixed price for that revenue piece.
Not for the revenue piece.
We have two pieces. We have a contract piece, which is a firm fixed price on labor
Right.
and O&M. And then there's a variable piece, which is an estimate based off the revenues that Arizona Ambulance was getting as the contract person. That was deducted off the price, the firm fixed price. And so if we do have more runs than Arizona Ambulance, we go higher than the original contract. If we go below it, then there's less. But even with less revenue, if we do not meet that goal, there's still plenty in the firm fixed price to meet the needs of the fire department.
All right, setting that part aside, so we had the original ambulance. Well, we had the ambulance team that was working for we'll just call it the city fire department proper. We added the second team on. I remember that, and that's where the disparity is between the projections.
Correct.
Now, setting aside the Fort piece, is there an assumption that the second ambulance team will ever generate the revenue that was projected?
Well, there's a whole bunch of variables that go into that. We hope that they will, but it depends on the run time, it depends on accidents, and depends on who pays us.
Does that extra team, are they certified to go out and help with responses or anything like that, or are they strictly transport?
No, they run 911 responses.
And then have we been able to see if they're contributing value to curbing down some of the response times that were brought up as an issue a year ago?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
I think, Councilmember Mount, if we continue to see growth in calls for service, then certainly that second ambulance crew will be bringing in the revenue that was initially projected. It's just maybe a year or two out.
Well, the first part, I just want to make sure we weren't getting into firm fixed price trouble with the other one. But the other piece is I'm almost less concerned with the revenue if we're actually curbing the call times down with the second team. I think that's a more than ethical trade-off. Okay. I think we're okay with that. The second question I had, and maybe I'm getting a little too far myself, is I know that we're surging the money in for the West End development, and this process for me has been convoluted, to say the least. So the grant money from the MPO, and I've yet to really get that kind of nailed down. It seemed like I get a different answer where I go, and maybe that's my fault. So the MPO has moved the money around. The city has been responsible for the project. So the city floats it to the community several years ago now, at least it feels like. We had the public calls, and we all talked about it up here, and then we had to find a way to fund it. So we started to use the MPO to start trying to move the money through and get that consolidated. Looks like that money's there, but I don't think that we ever got a firm head nod on this is the project that we're actually going to do. And my big concern, and I started at 7th Street. I think I'm using the right street there. 2nd Street, over there where Trail Boss and Apocalypse Arms and all that is. I went and talked to every business owner I could find who was in that building for weeks, and I can't find the consensus. And I've talked to the public, and I can't find the consensus. So I guess the question I have is, are we locked in to doing the lane diet on Fry Boulevard if we approve this budget? Is that what this step is?
You are not locked in, and I will tell you that the project for the MPO is on North Garden south to Fry Boulevard. And
no, this includes the Fry.
That's right.
Well, but let me finish here. We still have to do the engineering, and that's what we should be doing this next year. And the engineering includes the intersection on Fry Boulevard. And the question then is how much money we're going to have to move to the east on Fry Boulevard. And my understanding is that without the engineering, we don't know how far we're going to be able to spend that, how far that money is going to spread. Obviously, we would narrow lanes on North Garden, but again, the lane diet question comes into mind because once we hit that intersection, there still has to be the ability to once the new main gate, if they ever have a problem, we have to be able to manage traffic through the old main gate. So the question is where does the narrowing start? And none of that's been discussed in my mind, to my knowledge, with the property owners on Fry. And that's what needs to happen once the engineering is done. We need to go back to the property owners so they make sure that they still have delivery, they still have access, they still have the same amount of parking, et cetera. And none of that, my opinion and my understanding is none of that work has been done. It has been done to an extent on North Garden, but it hasn't been done on Fry.
Well, Mayor Mueller, the first part of the process is obviously to begin the engineering work, and that is estimated at $200,000 to $300,000. Typically, engineering starts with a design concept, so options will be developed. It is envisioned we will use a public process to go through that process and then have the council bless the final design of that before we contemplate letting contracts and those kind of things. So the money is in the budget because we anticipate getting that money this fiscal year. I don't believe that construction money will be spent at all this fiscal year, and I think we're looking at next fiscal year before that starts.
So we were talking engineering and a public process, and
Yes.
then the construction.
Yes.
And this vote doesn't, all this vote really does is accept the money. It doesn't really commit it.
Yeah, and so and I believe you. Here's the part when I've talked to a couple of these. I'm not going to say their names. I'll talk to you offline about it, some of these business owners. And this kind of goes back to maybe some of the discussion that happened before, where I know we have excited people about some of their projects, but when they're telling business owners that this is absolutely what's going to happen and this is what's going to occur, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page, that where we're at in the process. So I'm okay with North Garden and South Garden both getting completely worked out. I don't think that that's going to be a major issue. And I actually really like the idea of beautifying Fry. That lane diet, I think, is just a really bad idea, and I don't think I'm alone in that based on what we've seen with just some of the traffic patterns just from some minor construction that's gone on up there. So I just want to make sure before we say yes, we know exactly what we're saying yes to, and if it doesn't involve a firm decision to narrow Fry, then I'm okay. But if it's, no, this is what we're doing and we're now railroaded back into this, I'd like to know that now.
We need to approve the engineering first, and the engineering will deal with the lane diet. The key thing that you have to remember here is if we want to make it a more walkable, usable space, the only place we can put public amenities without purchasing it from private hands is within the right-of-way. So if we don't do a lane diet, there are some things we will not be able to do along that stretch. And that's, again, for future discussion item.
I'm okay with it being a future discussion item, and we can discuss walkability versus trafficability and businessability, I guess, then, but I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
All right.
Moving into debt, just a quick snapshot and a refresher on the city finances, certain capital projects based on a variety of factors. They're listed there for you. Our financing terms match the expected life of the equipment when we finance equipment. The city takes on two different types of debt, long-term debt in the form of bonds and short-term debt in the form of lease purchases. Our debt service by fund is, as you see here, in the general fund. The change you see is due to financing 4 ambulances this year, 2 in regular rotation, 2 for the Fort contract. Those will be covered, the ones for the Fort, by the IGSA.
Victoria,
Yes.
excuse me, when you call it debt service by fund, does that mean the amount of money that's taken out of each fund? Or, well, explain what that means, debt service by fund.
It's the debt service that's ascribed to each individual fund, so I don't know if that,
So dollars are pulled from the general fund to this amount to help pay off the debt.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just like a mortgage, so.
That's
there's a
not
cer-
saying much.
We
But-
take out a certain amount of debt, by fund. Most of it, you see, is in the Sierra Vista Municipal Property Corporation Interest and Redemption Fund. Though that's where your 2 large bonds were before they were refinanced. So basically, your budget, your FY 2019 budget includes $4.4 million to pay the payments that are due next fiscal year from each of those funds. And once that is subtracted from the total debt line, that will leave $15.6 million in total debt for the city. I will say that, this has been a real success story for Sierra Vista over the past number of years to be able to lower the debt to these manageable amounts over a period of time when the economy was not very good here. And we're looking forward to the 21-22 timeframe, as I mentioned before, because you'll certainly have room to be able to do some other things at that point. Mm-hmm.
I think I get it. Thank you.
Still learning too, Gwen. It's okay. I think that pretty well covered it. Are there any other questions on this slide? Okay, moving into operations and maintenance. I have a couple slides coming up that go into more detail on some of these line items and what the major changes have been. But just to point out real quick that some of the changes that you saw in the budget book were changes that happened both up and down. So a lot of decreases were made based on actuals in different line items. There were increases that were also made in various lines. And pointing out specifically leisure and library, that increase was due to moving parks back to leisure and library from public works. And I'll go through some of the other ones here on the next couple slides. So economic development and finance are both budgeted under city manager. So that $504,000 decrease, most of that was due to the OEA grant being split over 2 years. And in finance, there was $65,000 moved out of professional services. We moved outside ambulance billing to salaries and hired a person to handle that for the city instead of contracting it outside of city staff. There were a number of significant increases in IT, increases in software. There's additional Munis training. We just upgraded our Munis software as of last week. And so we're planning additional training for staff on that. And there's a RecTrack upgrade coming for leisure and library services that has been due for some time and much needed. The professional services increase in IT is GIS due to our GIS and our county systems are connected. And it was time for a significant update and cleanup of both of those to make sure that they match and are up to date. In specialized supplies in IT, we're budgeting for mobile computers for PD admin and to start phasing in mobile computer replacements for the fire department. For police, we're budgeting an additional amount for travel and training, and that's due to academy fees. Chief Thrasher, would you give a short update on what's going on with the academy for police recruits?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, members of council, we received a letter about 3 weeks ago from the Tucson Police Department that basically is they're going to start charging us $15,000 per recruit. So we're now looking at different options, including partnering with the Cochise County Sheriff's Department and Cochise College to start our own academy down here. So not only that, the other academies across the state are increasing fees, and we have to pay both for housing and per diem while they're at the 17-week academy.
What were we paying before?
We were only paying per diem. So we are paying roughly around $5,000–6,000 per recruit per diem. So we have that plus the additional $15,000 on top of that.
It's $20,000 per recruit, give or take. How many
That's right.
recruits do you normally roll through a year?
So this year so far we have 4 so far this year. Last year we had 3. It depends on the openings and whether or not we hire laterals versus somebody that needs to go through the academy.
What would be the cost of starting an academy up here locally?
So right now that's through Cochise College. Cochise College has approval to start an academy starting September 4th. Our cost regarding that, we haven't worked out the fees yet. They're going to try to keep it under $5,000 per recruit to include housing and per diem. Plus, we'll have to send some instructors down there at cost. We're going to try to do that on duty, or the college will try to pay them themselves directly. So hopefully it'll keep it cost minimal compared to the $20,000 that would be required if we continue to send them up to the Tucson Police Academy.
So it's not a brick and mortar academy. We have a different curriculum provider going through Cochise.
It's the same exact curriculum, but it'll be housed at Cochise College. down in Douglas at their dorms. And so it's more now fees for trying to get our instructors and equipment for the training.
And any idea when this will be finalized?
For sure, there'll be an academy that'll start September 4th.
Sweet. Good job.
That's fantastic. Another question, Adam. Oops. Just a second. Let's see. Darn it. It's gone. I'll get back to
Come
you.
back to it.
And the decrease you saw with the fire department is due to the adjustment from the IGSA contract. Again, we over budgeted for that last year and have reduced that to what the actual cost will be. There are a number of changes in Public Works, of course, as our largest department. Utilities have increased, as we have alluded to in the past month or so. Electric went up in streets. That's the street lights that the city does own, and street or traffic signals. And the increase in water is due to one company raising rates on the city somewhat unexpectedly earlier this spring. In professional services, we are budgeting $50,000 in the event we would have to hire a consultant to apply for a ZIPTES permit, which I'd ask Ms. Flassar to explain what a ZIPTES permit is. And this is due to the case that recently was heard regarding Hawaii that Sharon can explain more about.
Mr. Mayor, members of council, in short, an ZIPTES permit is related to the Environmental Operations Park. It's a discharge permit over and above what we have, the permits we already have in place for that facility. Would require additional monitoring out at the Environmental Operations Park. As noted by Mrs. Yarborough, there was recently a case in Hawaii which could have implications for us here in Arizona. So that's what we're looking towards, and the potential to have to get that permit.
If we did have to get the permit, it would be extremely time intensive. We don't have the capacity or capability on staff to apply for or manage that permit. And so that's why we are budgeting that amount in the event that we would have to move forward with that. In vehicle maintenance, we're seeing an increase in parts costs, especially those manufactured overseas, unfortunately. In refuse, we are budgeting an increase due to the tipping fees increasing. Street maintenance, we're budgeting additional funds for street maintenance. And in sewer, we are decreasing infrastructure maintenance by $50,000 due to fewer point repairs needed.
Is there anything we can do to, right now our vehicle parts are all being bought through, what's the program that we have?
NAPA.
We're going through NAPA. Is there anything that we can do to find secondary markets that could help lower those costs, or are we locked into some sort of binding contract to go through NAPA?
Mr. Mayor, members of council, the increase in this line item isn't really reflective of the NAPA contract. It's just kind of the way the vehicle market is going. The cost of vehicles is increasing, new vehicles, and also our parts to fix the vehicles. As you know, the last few years we've been able to switch out some vehicles in our fleet, so we're not getting parted to death anymore. But when we do have to replace stuff, the cost for those parts has steadily increased over the last few years. NAPA has helped us to save money in that our technicians are no longer spending their time looking for parts, they're repairing vehicles. And NAPA is handling the ordering. We do have the ability in that contract to specify to some degree if there is a part that we know the reliability isn't as good and we want to go with something else, we have the ability to do that. But in general, their job is to find the lowest possible cost for us.
What's the biggest driving cost for maintenance? Which department? Is it transit? Is it police? Is it fire? Is it the cars that are parked out behind here?
Fortunately, I don't have the data on that right now. I can get it.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Chief Thrasher. Oh, no, wrong chief. Fire.
The other Chief Thrasher.
The other chief.
The one in the white shirt. I remembered my question. But wait, we were talking about police training, right? Okay. Never mind, Chief York. Chief Thrasher, do we have the ability to require those who have been trained to stay on for a certain amount of time following that expensive training?
Currently, at the moment, we do not have individuals sign a contract. I know it's been explored. There's some minor issues, I think, with that, having to do that, but we have not made people sign a contract. I know some agencies have tried to do that. Holding them to that can be very difficult in this day and age, but it's not something we do at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
A snapshot of our operations and maintenance budget overall, just over $22 million. Public Works at 31%. Fire and police follow, leisure and library, and our other departments and divisions. Moving into personnel, our personnel changes for the next year. Again, there were no new positions added. We were able to maintain the class comp plan. There is a 2% salary increase for all eligible employees included in this year's budget, which came to a total of $359,374. It includes our PSPRS contribution of $412,736,000. Next year, we expect an additional amount in PSPRS contributions on top of that $412,000. We did have a number of reclassifications in personnel this year.
Before
Yes,
you go
Mayor?
on, you mentioned PSPRS contribution. What was the ASRS contribution? I just want to compare the two. You remember what that was? Round figures. You don't need to give me to the penny.
Round figures, we pay less than 12%, and the employee pays less than 12%.
No, what is the number? Total number.
That
So I can compare it to the 412.
Victoria. While he's looking that up, the PSPRS this year is 412,000 plus. So for next year, is it in addition to that 412, or will it be another solid?
Mueller, Councilmember Calhoun, this is the amount over and above last year's figure. So
Okay.
That's how much it increased this year, and we expect an additional increase in the hundreds of thousands of dollars again next year.
I see. Thank you.
State retirement, PSRS.
The total amount we're paying in state retirement this year is $1,322,435.
So when you say state retirement, you mean both together?
No, that's ASRS.
And what was I want to know what the increase was, ASRS.
The increase over last year, Mayor?
Yeah.
$67,786.
Okay, so significantly different. Okay, got it. Thank you.
67,000. And the increase was 412. Wow, that's a big difference.
Okay, there were 4 reclassifications positions this year. The position of parks maintenance worker, one of the positions, was reclassified to a parks maintenance technician in order to dedicate one person to ball field maintenance. This is an economic development move that Ms. Wilson proposed in order to really focus on the health of our ball fields in order to do such things as attracting the tournaments that she has started attracting in already and make sure it's a good playing experience and that people want to come back. The increase to the budget for that position was just under $3,500, but money was actually saved because Leisure and Library decided to no longer continue DOC inmate workers with parks. In Public Affairs, a customer service representative position was reclassified to media technician. The position works with quite a lot of video, and so it was felt that was a more appropriate classification for that position. Also in Leisure and Library, a recreation coordinator was reclassified to a sports supervisor, which will move the position from non-exempt to exempt and create cost savings in comp time and overtime that was paid to this position, and will also help rededicate time and resources to those sports events and sports tourism coming into the community. Then 3 supervisor positions were changed from non-exempt to exempt. Those were in refuse, parks, and streets. And there was no cost impact for reclassifying those 3 positions. In reviewing our classification and compensation steps and how these are assessed based on questions from Mr. Mount earlier in the year, when the new classification and compensation plan was implemented, December 31st was established as the cutoff date. Our HR division spent a lot of time looking at the different ways and methods, and there is no perfect way to implement classifications and compensation plans and to determine a perfect method of determining where staff need to go. And so a cutoff date needs to be chosen somewhere. And so the method that was chosen was December 31st as the cutoff date, and this was applied to all city employees as they were assessed for the new classification and compensation plan. So those who were in their position under 6 months were placed in step 1. There is no step 0. It doesn't make much sense to have a step 0. Those in their position 6 months to 1 year were moved to step 2. And so somebody then who was in their position for 1 year and 7 months was moved to step 3. If somebody was in their position for 1 year and 4 months, they were placed at step 2. So what that does is it avoids compression amongst all the different levels of staff. I'm going to switch to the next slide real quick to give you some examples. I'll switch back to talk about what the other options are. So these are some actual examples of city staff that exist here in the city without names. We had a couple admin secretaries, one who was hired in July of 2017 last year, and so that person did not get the 2017 step raises, they were just hired. Admin Secretary B was then hired in February of 2018, and so only having been here for 5 months, that person will not be eligible for the step raise this year in July 2018, but the person who was hired last year will, and so that will maintain a step in between the 2 positions. Our firefighter examples illustrate this rather well. We had one who was hired in January 2017. So that person was not eligible for the step increase in July of 2017, and so they will be getting their first step increase this year in July 2018. There were 2 firefighters who were hired in April, and so only having been here for 2.5 months, they will not see a step increase in July 2018, but that firefighter A will see it. So if they had received step increases, if firefighter A had received step increase last year, what happens then is not so much in between firefighter A, B, and C, but you start running into all of the other people who were assessed in the class comp plan before, who are at the levels they're at, that now these 3 would have been crossing over people who had been here for a while before them. And so this maintains the consistency across the entire class comp plan and make sure that there isn't compression within that firefighter designation. Police officer recruit A and B are just further examples of somebody who was hired in April of last year who did not see a step increase in July 2017, and then somebody who was hired in June of this year who will not see a step increase next month, but that recruit A who was hired last year will see their first step increase. And so going back, this is not the only way that promotions can happen. This is not the only way that step increases can happen. One way that used to happen here in the city was staff used to see raises on their anniversary date. It was a very time-intensive way of handling raises. It also, one of the other reasons that it happens on July 1st is that if we have any increases in health insurance, if we have any increases in retirement contributions, the person is able to get that raise, and if there's an increase in a contribution, it happens about the same time. If the step increase happens any other time during the year, you may see a delay in getting a increase in costs, and then you have to wait until you get your raise. The other option is that promotions could be held until July 1st. If there are any promotions that happen in between January and June, the person could either serve that capacity in an interim or on an interim basis, or the promotion could be held until July 1st. Yes, Mr. Mountain.
Okay. So what's the purpose of this step increases?
To maintain consistency
Of what?
in the entire plan, the classification and compensation plan, it places people in a step based on how many years they've worked for the city.
Okay. So how many years? So it's based on their amount of time that they've worked for the city.
Yes.
And it scales appropriately, cost of living factors, marketability.
Matched
within
against the
things.
market,
Yeah.
it's matched against the market analysis.
So, and I get, look, I'm right there too. We deal with the same stuff over where we're at is dealing with the federal government. We have to have everything audited by the Department of Labor. We have to show how it all works, and I get it. I think, though, that the anniversary way, the employee's anniversary date, makes it more equitable. I know there's a harder management tail into it. I do, and I empathize with it. But there's a piece there that matters. I think that's the easiest way to at least alleviate the problem of maybe some of this equity theory that's being kind of tossed around. But now there's another piece here. So when we talk about somebody starting work with the city, they have to work a full year with the city in order to get their step, correct? Like they're working approximately 12 months.
Yes, they would have to be hired between July and December in order to get.
Over 6 months.
Yes.
Okay. But they work a period of time and then they get in. So if you have staggered, we don't hire everybody at the same time. So I don't know if we should adjudicate steps at the same time, if we're not hiring people at the same time. And the other thing that has me concerned, and really what brought this up to not just me, I know others here have been approached by it, but it deals with also the complexities of promotions, because when somebody gets promoted, they're also due for a pay raise.
They receive a 10% pay raise per ordinance.
Okay. And then how is that? Is that immediate?
Yes.
Okay. Now, are step increases, or is any of that merit-based, or is it all just simply time and grade?
Well, it's primarily time and grade based on performance. You have to meet performance measures in order to get it. So if you don't meet them, you wouldn't get it. But I can tell you most people do get it. So.
Sure. And that's what. Can you go back to your other slide, please? So the specific example that was brought up was the complexity of, if you go with police officer recruit A, police officer recruit B, let's say one starts, let's see, one gets hired before the other. One gets hired before the other. They have the same position. Or actually, let's say they get hired at the same time, and then one gets promoted before the other and gets their pay increase, and then something happens. Are their steps still in alignment? Are they still getting steps if one gets a promotion before that? Let me back up because that didn't make any sense to me because I got distracted. All right. So look, you got two cops who got hired at the same time. And if one gets promoted, is his promotion pay raise in place, and does that reset his step time for that position? That's a yes, right?
That's correct. So let's say they both get hired at the same time.
Uh-huh.
The police officer, say police officer A gets promoted after January, gets the 10%. That individual would not get the 2% come July.
But then the next
police officer,
gets...
police officer B gets it, okay, but gets promoted in September, then the 10%, so ends up above.
Right.
However, it also works out the other way around too, is if police officer A gets promoted in July, okay, and goes almost a full year, gets his 10% in July, comes back around, gets his 2%. Police officer B gets promoted in March. If he were to get his 2% also at the same time, they'd both be getting paid the same, even though one's been in position longer for 6 months longer.
Yeah, but the amount of money that the guy accrued by being in the position longer is the merit piece because he got promoted ahead of the other person.
But they'd both get their 2% if they all got it at the same time.
I'm not arguing that they should get it at the same time. I'm arguing that, so I think there's two pieces here that we have to figure out. I think the first is that having everything annualized solves some of the problems because you work for 6, 12 months, whatever the time frame is, you're going to get your 2% based on you're staying in the time position and then also assuming you got your 1% for doing a good job, right? Because that's what it is. It's 1% for being on. It's 1% merit-based. And then you get promoted. Well, getting promoted essentially is merit pay, I believe. We're promoting somebody up. They did a good job. They're getting a bonus. They're getting a title, et cetera. Somewhere in there, we've got to find a way to uncouple it. If not, we're going to continue to have some of these disparities. And I think the disparities could create potential issues over time. That's just what I think, and that's why I brought it to the council's attention. So I'm not sure what the solution is, but if I had to recommend one, I would say the steps are based on the person's annual date, and then the promotions and the pay raises that come with it are based on when they got promoted. And that's very similar to what they do in the military and most other organizations that I've ever seen or been a part of.
And we did do that prior to the class comp plan, coming into effect. I believe we had 18 people out of 300 some odd full-time employees that were affected 2 years ago, and I think the number was 9 last year, or the other way around. So we're not talking about large numbers of employees that have been affected by this. As we had to weigh, not only the administrative factors that come into doing anniversary date, but again, as was pointed out, because generally the changes in terms of health insurance costs and potential retirement system increases hit all on July 1. So we wanted to try to make the employees whole at that particular point in time. The trade-off was these small numbers of employees that get caught up in the time gap.
I understand all that. Pareto theory, right? 80-20 rule. I think what we've got is, 20%, obviously less than that, of the employees that we have are having some sort of an issue with it. But also that also creates the other issues that come along. I mean, if we're going to talk about the administrative costs, and let's talk about the holistic costs, are we or are we not having problems recruiting and retaining police, fire if we need them?
We are having problems, especially with the recruiting.
Is it an assumption that police and firefighters know other police and firefighters in other areas?
That's correct.
So I think
I think before you go there, you got to realize what are all the factors that impact the recruiting issue. It's not just this pay
I'm
disparity.
not saying it is.
Yeah. Okay.
No, I agree it's not, but I think it could be a contributing factor to it. I mean, if we're going to argue that the administrative burden is something to consider, I'd say also alleviating the concern from the officers who are affected is also another issue that should be taken into account. So that's generally where I'm at. It's up to council. I think, again, not to put too much more work on the HR department, but annualizing it and then dealing with the promotions as is alleviates the equity theory that's in play. If not, then we're just going to continue to hear about it.
Well, what I would like to hear from management at another time is the system that Mr. Mount just recommended doable?
Well, anything's doable, Mr. Mayor. I mean, we can do that. It changes kind of the workflow and all that. Again, I've only heard from one person. I assume it's the same person that's talking to council about this. So, and they're not all police officers that are affected. And we're somewhere way below 5% of the employee base that have been affected over the last couple of years.
The key thing is we need to be upfront and fair, at least in appearance, with all our employees, whether it's 2%, 1%, 50%. Well, if there's a better way to do it, so we can get to be fair and above board with all our employees, I think we need to at least hear from you guys as to what a solution may be.
Well, we brought up the options, so
So the options then would be?
to maintain the current system or change the date, which would be relatively the same, go back to anniversary date, and on the promotional part, hold them until July.
And is that manageable from, even though it may be a little more work, is that manageable from a personnel perspective, Barbara? Okay. And it's not going to affect future compression?
Well, that's the reason for the class comp plan to be in effect and to make the changes to the class comp plan when we have market adjustments and those kind of things, is to try and alleviate compression. It doesn't eliminate compression. For example, next year we'll have compression issues when the minimum wage goes up again at the lower end of the range. But that's why we work hard to try to keep the step plan in place and fund the class comp plan every year so that we don't fall back into the situation where we had compression before. This was just the way that was chosen to administer it when it first came in. I know there were many meetings held with employees to go over the system and how it would work when it came in. Were there a few people affected by it? Yes, there were.
So
Well, I'm not saying you weren't open with the employees, because I think they all knew that there were potential hitches in the system, but the bottom line is, I think most of the council, I may be speaking out of turn here, but I think most of the council wants to be fair and upfront with our folks, and if we do something like anniversary date and then hold promotions or whatever, however the proposal is, we need to let them know that that's going to start 1 July and then go on forever into the future. And the ones that basically, the 9 and 18 that had issues 2 years ago, are basically going to have to suck it up, because we're not going to go back and relook that. But again, we need to share the process with the folks as we go through the budget.
Well, probably the best thing we can do is to go back to the employees with these options and, get feedback from them. So.
Well, let me clarify my assumption, because I want to make sure now that, hi, Barb. If just for the step piece, if we annualize that based on the employee's hire date, that solves the 2% equity problem, because now it's just based on their individual annual time and grade, or time and service.
Well, if they got hired and then from their start date, yeah, the 2% comes into play on the anniversary date.
So that levels the playing field out.
The 2%, whether they could be forwards or backwards based on the December 31st.
So that solves problem A. And then problem B is solved with just whenever we have an opening for a promotion, somebody gets promoted, they get hired, they get the promotion, and then the pay that is commensurate with the position comes into effect. That's possible as well, right?
Yes, now that exists now.
Sure. So,
that happens as it is now at the 10% that's mandated.
So those two options. Now, is that something that is, we're able to execute that as an organization, correct? Both those two things?
You are able to execute that. So, kind of looking back in how this was implemented. So they got the first one in 15 when the budget was. So this is the third year, and we had been directed to break it up into 1/3, 1/3, and 1/3. So this is the final of the 3 years of the mini class comp to do those. So in saying that, this last year, those that have already, passed their anniversary date, this would be the last year of that. So what I would recommend is that you continue on with the July 1 of this year, because otherwise we would have had to implement that last year,
That's
if
reasonable.
that makes sense. So you would need to look at doing that going forward. So right now, where we're looking at the 2019 year, I would recommend you go ahead and go with July 1. And if you want to make that change, you look at making that change for 2020. And that would allow it to be an equitable change versus, you change everybody right now, just say July 1,
Sure.
and you do that, and then you start with the anniversary date, you're going to have penalized those in this last year.
No,
makes
that's
sense.
completely reasonable. That makes a lot of sense.
I would think it would be
so
a forward.
You're saying so it would be the 2019-2020 budget is when we would start to scale into that if we wanted
Correct.
to do that.
Yes, if you would choose to do that, I would recommend doing it for 2020.
That makes sense to me.
Okay.
I'd like to ask one clarification question, and that is, if the That's all right. I think you clarified it. I'm good.
Well, if I didn't, I can come back, okay?
Yeah.
All right.
I do think there is potential to hear about potential changes as well, though.
Well, it's not gonna hurt. We basically got a year is what we've said, Chuck. If we need to get the folks, the employees in and sit down and talk about it, and we need to talk, if there are other issues that are potential landmines, we got time to bring those up with the 2020.
Chuck, were you suggesting that our HR department that doing anniversary dates was an burdensome?
Well, it spreads the work through the year. We kind of have a flow in terms of how we do evaluations, when the raises go into effect. It's very easy. Obviously, it's all computerized, but it's very easy to calculate right now what the impacts of the raises are going to be on the budget. So there'll be some changes, but certainly it can be done. It's just, I think people will probably be concerned. Of course, I do think we should bring it back to the employees to see, how they would view any further changes before we make a recommendation back.
Yeah, you're going to have time to do that, I think. Okay. Thanks, Greg.
Thank you, Mayor.
Okay, and then personnel cost by fund. The change is predominantly as a result of maintaining the class comp plan and the PSPRS increase in the general fund. That decrease you see in the airport fund is due to a retirement and a new person being hired. Moving into capital projects, another snapshot of what the city is planning for capital projects this year. The highlighted items that I wanted to highlight this year or this afternoon were what your strategic plan related projects are. And so the first one you'll see is the Access Energy Management Project, and that relates to the strategic plan to explore ways to reduce energy use. On the next page, upgrading the electrical pedestals and Mango Pies lighting project are both related to the economic development strategic plan goal. Those two items feature heavily in the updated economic development framework, which you'll see next month in your strategic plan update. And the Fry North Garden design project, as we talked about before, relates to your strategic plan goal to partner with the MPO to fund and construct phase 1 of that project. It's considered a grant because of the HERF swap program. The school district tenant improvements, Kings Court is in parentheses there because that would move forward if we were fortunate to sell Kings Court. And then there were two items that we revised slightly from your packets. The environmental assessment for taxiway expansion out at the airport, that is grant funded, and the removal of the mountain of dirt out at the airport as well. That one was related to your strategic plan goal to evaluate ways to maximize use at the airport. Any questions about any of the capital projects before I move on to the unfunded projects?
Well, yeah, go back to, I'm sorry, Kings Court. So the idea is we sell Kings Court, we get cash, we move the cash over to the capital improvements fund, and then we do the school district tenant improvements piece.
So that's related to the strategic plan goal on a partnership with the school district and also the finding a cost-effective way to promote tennis in the community.
What you're talking about just with the, because we're still looking at retaining those viable courts that are still out there. Is that what we're essentially talking about?
No, we're talking about entering into a partnership agreement with the school district that staff and the district are currently working on to take over operation and management of all of the recreational properties behind the Rothery Center from Avenida Escuela over to the park. And so if we sold Kings Court, we'd be able to invest the money into those fields and the tennis courts and the basketball court behind there.
Got it. All right. So Kings Court is not being funded for anything. The cash from Kings Court is being used to fund other things through the partnership with the schools.
If it were to be sold,
If it were
yes,
to be
that
sold.
money would be used to invest in upgrading those properties.
Any buyers? Nothing yet? All right.
We're
Okay.
working through the final parts of that partnership agreement. We hope to bring that to council in July.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for clarifying.
And again, just looking at the unfunded capital improvement projects this year, it was a strategic plan goal to update the capital improvement plan. This year, we were able to pick off some of the low-hanging fruit this first year, but there's still quite a few capital projects, which also goes back to Mr. Mount's point on some of the higher dollar projects and how the city might be able to fund those in years to come.
What's the co-renovation?
That was replacing the Pebble Tech and I think the decking. I see staff nodding over there.
The other one was the, and I'm sorry, did I interrupt? Oh. The other one that was on there that I thought council had shown some interest in was the, was it the Blackout Theater? What was it called? The Black Box Theater thing? Is that not something that is considered a capital project?
It is.
Is that something that it's not funded, correct?
Correct.
Did it need to be on here?
It's not on the list, is what you're saying.
The capital improvement plan will be reviewed every year. So it will be reviewed and ranked and scored, which will also give the opportunity for new projects to be evaluated and scored and added to the plan each year. So I don't believe that project made it into the list for consideration this year. Ms. Flassar is looking at me.
Yeah. Mr. Mayor, members of council, the projects that were considered for the CIP this year were largely existing projects from previous years. They've been on the plan for a while. The Black Box Theater came out in the commission reports that have just happened within the last few weeks, months. So the ranking had actually already taken place. The budgeting process had started before that project became known.
So those were brought up during the commission meeting. The Arts and Humanities brought that up, and I believe they also brought up a couple others.
Shade structures.
The shade structures, things like that. So how soon do we need to feed forward that information from the commission so that they get onto the schedule for consideration, if that's the issue?
Okay, Mr. Mayor, members of council, if I understand the question, it's when would we need to hold commission meetings in order to include that information in the budget for next year?
Yep.
Okay. We would potentially then be looking at a time late fall, because we typically start the budgeting process around February of each year.
Yeah. I think one of the things we need to do, and we may have talked about this when the commissions were doing their reports, is we need a complete list of all the things each commission brings to those presentations. We need to see that, and even if it is at this point too late, that way we at least kind of see and can respond to the commissions about the things and the reason why they didn't get on the budget. And I don't know that they understand that. We've been late asking them for that information, and every year it's like that. So that question you just asked about when do they need to report, or when do they need to request, et cetera, has to happen earlier. But even for me, for right now, I'm not even sure what was on that presented or requested by each one of the groups. So we need to do some work on how we work with the commissions on those things anyway. Chuck?
Mr. Mayor, members of council, this is the first year that we changed the CIP process. It used to be done working with the Citizens Advisory Commission. Of course, that commission no longer exists. So this is the first run of staff looking at the overall capital needs of the city. and changing the criteria under which they were evaluated and rated. Of course, we place a high value on public safety, and then economic development is also a high value criteria that we've been using to try to rate the projects. This represents years 1 through 5, but by state law, if the impact fees are reinstituted when the moratorium is over, we do need to take that out to 10 years. So we need to add a 6 to 10 year component to the CIP as well. You know, a lot of different people have different ideas in terms of what types of projects you would like to see, and I'm sure all 7 of you all have different ideas in terms of what needs to be in the CIP as well. I think the only way to really flesh that out is to you know, have the complete CIP list put together, and basically, you know, it is within the budget and needs to be there, but the council, I think, needs to weigh in on what the priorities need to be. Just because, you know, we say the project should be on there, or you know, somebody else doesn't necessarily make it a project worthy of being on the list, or what the priority needs to be. I can tell you for a fact this Cove renovation project is really a maintenance project that's going to need to be done and probably will appear in next year's budget, because you can't really operate the Cove safely unless those things are completed. So that's going to rise to the top of the list because of the nature of what needs to be done there. You know, ball field renovations, Ms. Wilson's been working on plans to try and get that done to make them more tournament acceptable, and to try to bring in people, so that counts as a project that we're looking at in terms of economic development. But you know, the community center, we've talked a little bit about that in our meetings, and you know, the things that need to be done there. It's an old building that's going to need to be replaced. So, you know, I think we need buy-off from the council in terms of what the priorities are for projects in the future, and then you know, how they're going to shake out in terms of the budget. And of course, budget only has so much money for it, and sometimes we have to pick off opportunities as they come up. Either funds become available or grant funding becomes available, and we're able to move those up to the list because of funding availability primarily.
You know, I think part of what I think about when we see the list and we see what's getting funded is just having that kind of conversation, Chuck, over the recommendations that come to us from the departments and from management, and then and the reasons why, you know, and you've done that, but that's what, you know, I think we need to have happen. And maybe, I'm not sure, maybe before we get to this point, but that's what this point is for anyway, to go through this, but it's a little hard. We see what the recommendation is for funding, and we see what's unfunding, and we don't see that next level of projects that might be of major interest pertaining to the strategic plan. So I'm not 100% sure, and what the conversation we just had and what we had when we met with you, and maybe what individually we had with different departments, helps to understand why you're making certain recommendations. I don't know if everybody's privy to that, or, you know, how that's worked out, but.
Well, those are good points, and it's a multifaceted situation because, you know, we've had projects that have been on the plan that, you know, we haven't been able to fund. I think you have a level of council and public input, you know, that the commissions have provided in terms of, you know, what they would like to see the community have. And I also think then there's a level of staff input because, you know, funding a sewer project may not be on the, you know, on top of everybody's list, but might be something that really needs to be done. Right. So I think you need, you know, all those different levels of input, and we probably should take all the projects and then bring them back to the council in terms of a separate work session to discuss what the capital plan needs to look like, and further refine this process for next year.
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea, a good way to get everybody involved in the whole conversation.
few more slides of unfunded projects. The next slide has the EOC remodel at the PD, visitor center relocation, mission control devices in the fire station bays, ball fields, city hall improvements, and then a new building at Veterans Park for parks maintenance, renovating the mobile command post, covering vehicles at the PD, and pavement at Fire Station 1 and 2.
And all of those kinds of projects, I know the departments submit them, and then a process happens that says that'll have to wait, that'll have to wait, that'll have to wait.
Well, let me ask you this. Now, I think at least from the first time that I went through the budget, which I was still learning, I know the last couple have been great. It's a balanced budget. I haven't heard any department managers or anybody raise up major concerns without some of these things funded. I mean, we're still able to do our job and do our work with minimal impact on our abilities, correct? Yeah.
There are issues.
Well, I'm not saying there's no problems. I'm not trying to get you there, Chuck. I'm just simply saying that the
we can operate with this budget.
Okay. All right.
Are the citizens going to see any big changes in the way services have been offered and any of our services?
No, I believe we'll be able to maintain, our service levels fairly well. I think most of the pressure is in public safety, police department and fire department. So that slide isn't up yet, but we are going to have to take a look at staffing in those two departments as we move forward and as calls for service increase. And we weren't able to accomplish that this year, but I think you'll see recommendations to increase staffing in public safety in next year's budget. But right now, I'm planning to look at overfill in certain departments because we do, police and fire in particular, because we do have turnover in those areas, and to try to get to full staffing is difficult. So we're going to try to implement some techniques in terms of overfilling to try and account for that, and then we need to come back to you with staffing recommendations in the next budget. I'm hoping we're able to do that because if we continue to see improvement in the local economy and local sales tax receipts, that should give us some room to accomplish a little bit more than we have been. And that's really what has made this budget better this year than the last 10 before this, I'd say, is just the improvements in the local economy have really helped our revenue situation.
Okay, and finally, the CDBG grant projects this year, which were included in that capital list, are ADA sidewalk ramps, curb gutter and sidewalks on 5th Street, and alley improvements on 1st and 2nd Street. Issues, as Chuck touched on a minute ago, public safety retirements, PSPRS costs continue to increase, as we already covered as well. Public safety staffing, the unfunded capital improvement projects, as we just discussed. Street maintenance is another big item. Although we are so pleased to see HERF revenues increasing, it's still only a drop in the bucket in terms of what needs to be done to our streets. The pavement index assessment is nearly complete. We'll have a better picture of the depth of the problems across the community, and that's a strategic plan goal that will be finished in the next year, so you'll be seeing more information on that soon. One item not on the list here, but was mentioned earlier, the minimum wage increase. As that continues to go up for our minimum wage part-time staff, we're going to see the point where that crosses our full-time class comp structure here soon, and so next year we will need to look at addressing that.
One of the things that I might add to this is when the council does their strategic planning for next year, we need to look at a couple of things. One is, with the number of projects we have, are we going to be at some time in the near future be able to, again, I hate to say this, but go into bonded indebtedness again once we get that monkey off our back? Are there things that we need to use bonding to facilities to build? And that needs to be discussed specifically in the strategic planning process, so we can meet the future requirements, and of course, the ongoing costs of operating the facility that is redone. And we can do things like, if we can find borrow $8 million to rebuild the rec center, maybe we put the black box theater in that sucker instead of having to stand alone. So those are the kinds of things that are for future discussions and strategic planning, and I just wanted to add that. Thanks.
And so, Mr. Mayor, members of council, your tentative budget vote will be at the end of June, on June 28th. The final budget vote happens on July 26th, and the budget process wraps up with the property tax vote on August 9th.
Is this the appropriate place just to raise the topic? I'm not making any suggestions about increasing property tax to the allowable amount. That would help cover some of the costs some of the cost of some of the things that we weren't able to fund this year.
Well, that's always a good time. This is always a good time to sit down and talk about future taxes. And I'll just express my feelings on taxes in general. If we have a need to do something for the community, and I think we've probably covered most of the needs in this, maybe not as thoroughly as we would have all liked to, but we've covered the needs. The question is why do we raise the taxes? We need to have a good reason to raise the taxes, and a very good reason to raise taxes. We don't do it because we want to do something that's nice for the community. And once a tax normally goes in, it will stay on the books. It rarely gets reduced, although we as a council in the past 15 years have done that once or twice. It rarely gets reduced, and we need to make sure it's for a proper public purpose. So I don't have an issue sitting down and discussing whether or not we want to do a property tax or a motel tax or whatever. But again, it needs to be based on need, rather than it appears to be the right thing to do for this group, or it appears to be the right thing to do for just this project. It's the same thing with going into debt. You don't just willy-nilly go into debt. You need to make sure it's a key element that has to be paid for. It is needed in the community. It's not just a nice to have thing. So we have to be very deliberate in when we talk about raising taxes and identify the specific need to raise the tax, because it's other people's money. And it's our money too.
Well, it's citizens' money for the community.
Yep.
And I'm just, for the sake of conversation too, for instance, multi-use paths, they might fall under it's nice, but they can also fall into the category of health and, pardon me?
Health
and
attractiveness to the
wellness
community
and,
to draw businesses in. Like
Right.
There's a number of reasons.
And something that's more permanent that, you can always see the result of it. The results don't go away. So, I'm not proposing we raise property taxes, but I'm just, maybe council wants to comment on things that they see as a need or a nice to have that benefits the community and would be worthy of spending property taxes for. So I don't know if this is the time for that. Chuck, you gave me some good input on the kinds of things that would be considered reasonable.
Well, if you're talking about property taxes specifically, there's primary and secondary property tax. And in terms of the primary property tax rate, the legislature has, really restricted us in terms of the benefit in terms of raising revenue that would bring, and the council has chosen over the past number of years not to do that, because we're only talking about a couple $100,000 or so in terms of taking the rate to the maximum. And, you know, the percentage of the budget there is small, although, you know, would be helpful in some areas. The other one is probably something that needs to be talked about again in strategic planning and in looking at funding future CIP needs, and that's the secondary property tax, which does require a vote of the public in terms of funding those particular projects. So that's one of the 2 or 3 methods that we have to raise funds for capital projects. And that gives you a pretty good idea whether the public wants to do that or not, because they have to vote on it. And, you know, certainly a lot of work and education has to go in to put together a bond package for projects like that. Of course, you can use the Municipal Property Corporation in the future once we have that room to look at, you know, other projects that may need to be done, you know, and, you know, those only require a vote of the council. So, you know, our options are limited in terms of bond issues to address, you know, capital improvement needs, but it's our job to give you the options and let you know what the, you know, financial impacts of that would be to the public. So, and we plan to do that in the strategic plan, you know, next year.
Thank you. That's good.
All right.
That's kind of what I wanted out there.
We're at time. Does anybody have any?
I've got a meeting at 4:30.
Any last comments?
We're still meeting tomorrow to go through
Yes, indeed.
other pieces, correct?
We're not done.
What's the plan for tomorrow?
Tomorrow, we're reviewing the proposed recycling plan, and we are done with the budget presentation, but if there are any further questions on the budget, we can answer them then as well.
We're going to have time to get into some questions at the department level?
Okay. Any other comments? I want to thank you very much for your presentation. Madam Assistant City Manager, you did a good job, and thanks for the department heads for piping up when you needed to pipe up and help out, and looking forward to tomorrow's session. Meeting is adjourned.